Well, let's get back to sorting out unconstrained choice criteria for internal rate of return. And these are diagrams of the way present worth changes when the interest rate changes for the three assets that we talked about earlier. So this is the one that cost $1,000, then cost you $500, got you $800, got you $15, got you $2,000. This is the one that got you $1,000 and then cost you $450 for 3 periods. And this is the one that had cost followed by a benefit, followed by a cost, followed by a benefit. What we're going to do is we're going to use these three examples to sort out what unconstrained choice criteria looks like for internal rate of return. We'll start with this one right here. So this was the asset that looked like a classic investment. This is where you put in some money, $1,000, then $500, and then you got some benefits. And so what we saw was that as the interest rate increased, the present worth of this fell. And when the present worth hits zero, what you're identifying there is the internal rate of return. The internal rate of return is the interest rate that makes the present worth zero. Now, in order to sort out what a investment criteria is, I want to try out a couple of different interest rates on here. We're going to try out this interest rate right here. This is a minimum acceptable rate of return. Now, at this particular minimum acceptable rate of return, you can consult our present worth function here. Go up to it, make a left, you can see that the present worth is positive. Present worth being positive means that this is an asset that you would like to buy. And so one of the rules that you may come across here is that if the internal rate of return is greater than or equal to the minimum acceptable rate of return, then buy it. And that looks like a really good rule when you're dealing with things like asset A. Internal rate of return, bigger than the minimum acceptable rate of return, you buy it. A way of thinking about it is that you've got a choice of taking some of your hard-earned cash, throwing it into this account here that earns you, say, 10%, or throwing it into this account that earns 44.24%. Which one do you want to throw it in? You want to throw it in the one with the high interest rate. That's all that rule really reads out to. Again, makes total sense when we're looking at something like asset A. However, this rule does not make sense when you look at something like asset B, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick this minimum acceptable rate of return. We're going to try to make it that's kind of the same scale. And at this minimum acceptable rate of return, you can consult your present worth function, hang a left, and you find out that it has a negative present worth. It's not an asset that you want to buy. So this rule doesn't seem to work here because this internal rate of return is greater than the minimum acceptable rate of return. Well, this thing right here needs a qualification. And the qualification is that if the asset is an investment, meaning it's something like A, something where when the present worth is zero, that your, when the interest rate is zero, that your present worth is positive. This is one that was like an investment. This is the one that cost you money, and then got you money. Then this rule works. The rule works backwards if it's something like this, which is a loan. Remember, this was the asset that gave you money, and then you may have to pay it back a little bit later. And you can tell an investment is a loan when you set the interest rate equal to zero. You see this negative present worth right here. Well, if an investment is a loan, you have to flip-flop your inequality over there. And as long as the internal rate of return is going to be less than your minimum acceptable rate of return, that's the case that you're supposed to buy it. Now let me explain how the logic on that one works. Which would you rather go ahead and take? I'll fill in here with another minimum acceptable rate of return. Would you like to borrow money at the minimum acceptable rate of return rate, which is high? Or would you like to borrow money at the internal rate of return on this particular loan? So the idea is you'd rather borrow cheap money than borrow expensive money, and that's why the criteria works there. Now, the important qualification that is actually hidden in all this stuff right here is this one right there, which says that we're talking about the internal rate of return. Because here's a situation when there are multiple internal rates of return. And here's where things get tricky because you don't have a simple rule. your decision here depends quite intimately on what your minimum acceptable rate of return is. So for example, if you're looking at this range of minimum acceptable rates of return, if you consult your present worth function, all these values in here have positive values. So as long as your minimum acceptable rate of return is in this range, you're supposed to buy that particular asset. If you go to this next range of minimum acceptable rate of returns, those between 10 and 30, if you notice that this present worth function is negative throughout over there, and in this range you're not supposed to buy the asset. And again, you have this little range over here between 30% minimum acceptable rate of return and 50, where you are supposed to buy it, and then after this you don't at all. So the proper response to whether you buy it or not can't necessarily boil down to this simple rule, but it depends upon where you are in this function. Now, getting this idea across to clients is oftentimes one of the hardest things you can do. So what you're often forced to do is not tell them that the answers are, well, this thing has an internal rate of return of 10, 30, and 50. Trust me, I've had students that have had assets with 100 internal rates of return. What you do is you tell them the internal rate of return that leads them to the correct conclusion. So in this case, if they have minimum acceptable rates of return that are less than 10%, what you end up doing is that you tell them about 10%. And if you do, if they know this rule right here, they'll follow it and they'll know that they're supposed to buy this asset because their internal rate of return is 10% and it's larger than their minimum acceptable. It's a good idea. If, on the other hand, their minimum acceptable rate of return is in this range right here, between 10 and 30, you also go ahead and tell them about the 10%. Because their correct response is not to buy the asset. What you're doing here is they see that they have a minimum acceptable rate of return of, say, 25%, and you tell them that the internal rate of return is 10. They know not to buy this asset, and they're coming to the correct conclusion. You can do similar things here with this range. This is that buy range. And so it could be that they have a minimum acceptable rate of return of, say, 40%. Well, what you do is you go ahead and you tell them about the 50%. Because that's the internal rate of return that leads them to the correct conclusion, which is to buy it. So remember, unless your clients really understand this process, you are oftentimes omitting certain ones of these answers and only telling them the ones that lead to the correct conclusion. And this is the unconstrained choice criteria for internal rate of return. If your asset is an investment and the internal rate of return is greater than minimum acceptable, buy it. If the asset is a loan and your internal rate of return is less than minimum acceptable, buy it.